The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was characterized by speed, shock, and a profound sense of tactical superiority. The Wehrmacht had honed the art of blitzkrieg, relying on the rapid movement of armored divisions and close air support to shatter static defense lines. Their initial successes bred an overconfidence that would prove fatal against the vastness and resourcefulness of the Soviet state. German commanders, trained in maneuver warfare, held a certain disdain for what they perceived as the Red Army's sluggish, mass-oriented military doctrine. They viewed Soviet artillery as plentiful but poorly coordinated, an outdated remnant of World War I thinking that would be bypassed by their armored thrusts. Early clashes seemed to validate this perception, as disorganized Soviet units often fell victim to German operational brilliance. The focus was placed almost entirely on defeating the Soviet tank and air forces, with the supporting arms often relegated to an afterthought in strategic planning. Intelligence reports on the massive Soviet industrial capacity and the sheer number of artillery pieces were frequently dismissed as propaganda or sheer inefficiency. This cultural and doctrinal arrogance blinded the German high command to the fundamental Soviet belief in artillery as the primary force multiplier on the battlefield. They failed to grasp the doctrinal designation of the Rod Voisk, or God of War, which was a title of reverence for the Soviet artillery arm. Hitler himself prioritized the destruction of enemy armies in a quick summer campaign, underestimating the defensive depth that massed artillery could provide. The tactical training of the average German infantryman emphasized individual initiative and decentralized action, a stark contrast to the rigid, centrally controlled Soviet fire missions. This oversight meant German preparations for the defense against massed, long-range indirect fire were dangerously inadequate. The logistical framework designed to support the advancing panzers was ill-equipped to handle the sustained attrition that a massive artillery force would soon inflict. The early victories were bought at a price of ignoring the structural military differences that would eventually turn the tide of the entire conflict. The vastness of the front demanded a sustained, reliable source of firepower that only artillery could provide in the absence of complete air superiority. German arrogance was a strategic failure that would cost them dearly in the brutal, grinding wars of attrition that followed the initial advances. Following the disastrous losses of 1941, the Soviet military-industrial complex underwent a dramatic and brutal transformation under the command of the State Defense Committee. Production shifted eastward, safely out of the range of the German Luftwaffe, focusing on simple, robust, and overwhelmingly numerous designs. The Soviet philosophy was predicated on quantity having a quality all its own, a principle perfectly suited to the manufacture of reliable artillery pieces. The 122 mm M30 howitzer and the 76 mm ZS three-divisional gun became the workhorses of the Red Army, produced in numbers that dwarfed any Axis counterpart. These guns were easy to manufacture, maintain, and operate, allowing for rapid replacement of losses and quick training of new gun crews. Stalin's doctrine dictated that no offensive should be launched without an absolute, crushing superiority in artillery, measured by guns per kilometer of front. This focus on mass production allowed the Soviets to absorb staggering losses and still maintain an offensive capability that was constantly growing stronger. Artillery was not merely a supporting arm. It was the foundation upon which all successful Soviet operations were built, clearing the way for infantry and armor. The Soviet state poured an unprecedented amount of its wartime resources into the production of shells, explosives, and the heavy metal necessary for the gun barrels. Unlike the Germans, who sought to perfect a variety of specialized weapons, the Soviets concentrated on perfecting the mass application of a few proven, standard designs. This industrial strategy meant that while a single German artillery piece might have superior optics or a more complex carriage, the Soviet line had 10 guns firing back. The relentless output from factories like the Uralmash plant created an inexhaustible reservoir of firepower that the Wehrmacht could never match. By 1943, the Red Army was capable of fielding what were essentially artillery armies, massive formations dedicated almost entirely to concentrated fire missions. This strategic mobilization of industry directly translated into the capability to execute massive, multi-hour artillery preparations before any major offensive. The German command system was simply not designed to comprehend or counter the material scale of this Soviet commitment to mass firepower. It was an economic war of production as much as a military conflict, and in this regard, the Soviet Union's commitment to its God of War proved overwhelming. The BM-13, famously nicknamed the Katyusha, represented a radical departure from traditional artillery and became the terrifying symbol of Soviet firepower. This simple, truck-mounted multiple rocket launcher was the first mass-produced, self-propelled rocket artillery weapon in the world. Its primary strength was not accuracy, but its ability to deliver an immense volume of explosive force onto a target area in a matter of seconds. The psychological impact of a sudden, roaring salvo of rockets was devastating, earning it the grim nickname Stalin's organ from terrified German soldiers. The distinctive howling sound of the rockets in flight was an immediate indicator of impending doom that often shattered the morale of enemy troops before the rounds even landed. Katyushas were initially deployed secretly in the summer of 1941, their first major use at Rudnya demonstrating an unparalleled destructive capability against mass German troops. German intelligence initially struggled to identify and understand the new weapon, underestimating its future strategic importance. The ability of the Katyusha to rapidly move into a firing position, unleash its full payload, and immediately relocate made it a frustratingly elusive target for counter-battery fire. This highly mobile system perfectly embodied the Soviet doctrine of utilizing massive, concentrated, and fleeting moments of overwhelming fire superiority. It was a weapon designed for the offensive, to shock and demoralize the enemy, and to clear out large areas for the advancing infantry and tanks. The rocket's fragmentation effect was particularly deadly against soft-skinned targets, supply convoys, and troops sheltering in open trenches. Its simplicity allowed for massive deployment, with entire regiments dedicated solely to coordinating and firing these volatile, yet essential, systems. The Katyusha was instrumental in establishing the psychological reality for German troops that they were constantly under threat of instant, overwhelming destruction. It marked a turning point in the psychological warfare of the Eastern Front, demonstrating the innovative and brutal approach of the Red Army. The image of the Katyusha firing is a lasting memory of the sheer, unadulterated power unleashed by the Soviet God of War upon the Axis forces. This rocket artillery piece was the physical embodiment of the Soviet commitment to technological and numerical supremacy on the battlefield. The Battle of Stalingrad represented the critical inflection point where German tactical underestimation collided violently with the full force of Soviet artillery doctrine. In the urban meat grinder, the German reliance on maneuver warfare became irrelevant, and the battle devolved into a brutal struggle for every single building and street. The Red Army capitalized on this environment by utilizing their artillery, often firing over open sights, to reduce German strongpoints to rubble. The proximity of the fighting meant that German troops were constantly exposed to the concussive force and shrapnel of Soviet shelling, even when occupying cellars and basements. Artillery preparation for counterattacks became an art form, with concentrated fire missions designed to isolate and eliminate pockets of German resistance. The Soviets employed their guns in a decentralized manner within the city itself, providing immediate, responsive fire support to the embattled infantry. The Volga River provided the necessary logistical lifeline to continuously resupply the thousands of guns arrayed on the eastern bank, ensuring the barrage never ceased. German commanders were repeatedly caught off guard by the intensity and the sustained nature of the Soviet fire, which often pinned down their troops for days at a time. This relentless pounding prevented German forces from rotating or resupplying, contributing directly to the encirclement and eventual collapse of the Sixth Army. The psychological toll on the German soldiers was immense, trapped in a constant state of bombardment with no realistic hope of relief. Stalingrad was the clearest evidence that the Wehrmacht's reliance on their own superb tactical skill could not overcome the sheer material superiority of the Red Army's guns. The battle irrevocably shifted the perception of Soviet artillery from a crude, secondary force to the absolute, dominant factor on the Eastern Front. It demonstrated that in a defensive and offensive capacity, the god of war could turn any fortified position into an untenable hellscape. The German failure to suppress or even significantly damage the Soviet artillery across the Volga proved to be one of the most significant strategic failures of the entire war. The echoes of the guns at Stalingrad sealed the fate of the German Eastern Campaign and validated the Soviet dedication to massed, overwhelming firepower. Following Stalingrad, Soviet artillery doctrine evolved from a reactive, defense-oriented force to a highly organized, proactive instrument of offensive breakthrough. The concept of the artillery offensive was formalized, dictating the coordinated application of thousands of guns across a narrow sector of the front. This process began with meticulous, days-long planning, where every single gun was assigned a target in a multi-layered, time-on-target fire mission. Soviet engineers and surveyors worked tirelessly to establish precise firing coordinates, ensuring that the entire artillery complement could strike simultaneously. The goal was not just to suppress the enemy, but to completely obliterate their forward defenses, creating a gap for the tank and infantry armies to exploit. This preparatory fire was often sustained for several hours, churning the earth into an impassable morass and crushing German trenches and concrete bunkers. The concentration of firepower reached unprecedented levels, with up to 300 guns being arrayed per kilometer of the breakthrough sector in later operations. A key improvement was the implementation of effective counter-battery fire, utilizing forward observers and sound-ranging technology to quickly silence German guns. Soviet artillery became a unified entity, capable of shifting its focus from one target to the next in rapid succession, maintaining constant pressure. The German response was hampered by poor communication, inadequate reserves, and a failure to develop effective deep, fortified positions capable of withstanding such a bombardment. German defensive tactics of elastic defense often crumbled instantly under the sheer weight of fire, leaving no survivors to execute the planned withdrawal. The coordinated use of rockets, mortars, and heavy howitzers ensured that every meter of the battlefield was systematically covered by explosions. This new level of destructive coordination gave the Red Army a decisive operational edge that the Wehrmacht never managed to overcome for the remainder of the conflict. The methodical, crushing power of the Soviet breakthrough barrages became the defining characteristic of the Red Army's triumphant advance toward the German heartland. It was the ultimate vindication of the Soviet God of War philosophy, turning artillery into the key weapon for offensive success. For the average German soldier on the Eastern Front, the reality of Soviet artillery was a constant, terrifying, and inescapable presence that reshaped their concept of battle. The initial belief in German technical superiority quickly evaporated under the first sustained Ognjevoy Val, or wall of fire. Artillery was no longer an inconvenience to be endured. It was the primary cause of casualties, psychological trauma, and the disintegration of unit cohesion. German defenses, no matter how well built, were eventually reduced to unrecognizable piles of rubble and splintered wood by the relentless shelling. The sound of the incoming rounds, the earth shaking, and the smell of cordite and pulverized soil became the sensory landscape of the war. Many German veteran accounts describe the trauma of spending days pinned down in trenches, unable to move, resupply, or even communicate effectively. The high explosive shells, especially from the 152 mm howitzers, were capable of collapsing bunkers and dugouts, offering little sanctuary from the sheer concussive force. Soviet tactics often employed a hurricane of fire that would last for hours, followed by a sudden, terrifying silence that signaled the inevitable infantry assault. The psychological stress of waiting for the next barrage, knowing it could begin at any moment, led to widespread combat fatigue and mental breakdown. German medics struggled to cope with the sheer volume of shrapnel wounds and concussive blast injuries, which were far more prevalent than gunshot wounds. The relentless pressure also prevented German forces from executing effective counterattacks or repairing their lines, leading to a permanent state of defensive degradation. Commanders quickly learned that the safest place was often directly behind the Soviet barrage, following closely in the wake of the destruction to avoid another round of fire. The Soviet artillery had effectively negated the German advantage in infantry training and small unit tactics through the simple, brutal application of overwhelming force. This sustained pounding transformed the battlefield into an artilleryman's war, where the infantry's primary role was simply to survive the barrage and occupy the resulting moonscape. The new reality was one of endless endurance against the Soviet god of war, which had replaced the blitzkrieg with a strategy of systematic destruction. The logistical and engineering preparations for a major Soviet offensive were as critical as the firing itself, demanding a massive, coordinated effort. Before any major breakthrough, entire armies of sappers and support personnel were mobilized to construct the infrastructure necessary for the god of war. This included building hundreds of kilometers of new roads and rail lines, often under constant threat of German aerial reconnaissance and artillery fire. Tons of ammunition had to be meticulously transported forward, stacked, and cached in protected positions, often close to the front lines to minimize delay. Sappers were tasked with preparing the complex, fortified firing positions that allowed the heavy guns to remain stable and accurate throughout sustained firing. They also laid thousands of kilometers of signal wire for the centralized command and control network, essential for coordinating the fire of hundreds of batteries. The meticulous work of the topographical surveyors was equally vital, calculating the precise coordinates for all planned fire missions with extreme accuracy. This detailed planning and engineering effort ensured that the artillery preparation would be as effective as possible, leaving nothing to chance or improvisation. The German side often failed to recognize the sheer scale of these preparations, missing the telltale signs of the impending doom until it was too late. The establishment of multiple echelon firing positions allowed the Soviets to maintain a continuous fire for extended periods, rotating batteries to prevent overheating. This focus on the necessary groundwork contrasted sharply with the German reliance on rapid, often rushed deployment of their own, smaller artillery formations. The engineering support was the unsung hero that made the Soviet massed fire doctrine functionally possible on the vast, often muddy terrain of the Eastern Front. It demonstrated that the Soviet artillery advantage was not just about having more guns, but about having the dedicated, structured logistics to use them all at once. The Red Army understood that effective artillery was a complex system, not just a collection of weapons, and the engineers were the system's foundation. The Battle of Berlin in 1945 served as the ultimate, devastating testament to the final dominance of the Soviet god of war. The Red Army amassed an unparalleled concentration of artillery for the final assault on the German capital, creating a literal ocean of firepower. Over 40,000 guns and mortars were arrayed around Berlin, a density of firepower never before seen in the history of warfare. The opening barrage was not just a preparation. It was a psychological and physical demolition of the remaining German defenses. The sound of the barrage was so intense that it was reportedly heard hundreds of kilometers away, a ceaseless, roaring thunder that signaled the end of the Third Reich. The Soviet gunners fired an estimated 1.5 million shells in the opening days of the battle alone, systematically turning the city's outskirts into dust. This bombardment was so effective that many German defenders were killed or incapacitated purely by the concussive force of the explosions. The systematic reduction of every German strongpoint and defensive position ensured that the advancing Soviet infantry faced minimal organized resistance. The heavy 203 mm B-4 howitzers, nicknamed Stalin's sledgehammers, were used to demolish massive concrete bunkers and fortifications with direct fire. The final urban fighting was characterized by short, brutal pushes following immediately in the wake of carefully coordinated artillery strikes. This final application of massed fire showed that the Soviet Union had perfected its doctrine, utilizing artillery to achieve strategic and political objectives. German commanders, many of whom were now defending the city with militia and old men, could only watch in horror as their capital was pulverized. The scale of the destruction was a deliberate act of military policy, designed to break the will of the final defenders and hasten the final surrender. The fall of Berlin under the weight of this artillery barrage was the fitting, violent climax to the four-year struggle on the Eastern Front. It cemented the Soviet artillery's reputation as the single most destructive and decisive weapon system of the entire conflict. The effect of the Soviet artillery supremacy on German morale was one of the most critical, yet often underestimated, factors in the Red Army's victory. When artillery fire is constant and overwhelming, soldiers begin to lose faith in their equipment, their leadership, and their very survival. The relentless pounding instilled a sense of fatalism and futility among the German ranks, replacing their initial zeal with deep-seated resignation. The Soviet practice of sustained, long-duration barrages was deliberately designed to maximize psychological trauma and render the enemy incapable of organized resistance. German officers reported that the men became artillery shy, reacting with panic and paralysis at the first sound of incoming shells. The high casualty rates, combined with the gruesome nature of shrapnel wounds, eroded the cohesion of even the most hardened German units. Artillery fire often cut communication lines, isolated command posts, and prevented the delivery of much-needed medical and food supplies. This isolation compounded the fear, as soldiers felt abandoned and surrounded with no ability to call for help or coordinate a defense. The inability of the German Air Force or their own artillery to effectively suppress the Soviet guns further deepened the despair and sense of helplessness. By 1944 and 1945, the sight of a Soviet forward observer meant that the end was near, as they knew the overwhelming fire would soon follow his report. The shattered morale translated directly into shattered defensive lines, as pinned down troops were often unable to repel the subsequent infantry assault. The psychological warfare waged by the Soviet guns made the job of the advancing Soviet infantry significantly easier, often facing men who were already broken. The God of War was not only a physical destroyer of fortifications, but also a devastating psychological weapon against the German fighting spirit. The Red Army understood that war is fought in the minds of the soldiers, and the constant fear of artillery was a key tool in winning that mental battle. While Soviet success was largely defined by mass production, their early adoption and commitment to rocket artillery provided a genuine technological and doctrinal edge. The Katyusha was a simple weapon, but its utility for mass saturation fire was unmatched by any equivalent German system in the early to mid-war period. German rocket artillery, such as the Nebelwerfer, was a formidable weapon but was produced in far smaller numbers and lacked the high mobility of the BM-13 launcher. The Soviet commitment to the rocket platform allowed them to develop tactics of unprecedented flexibility in delivering concentrated fire over a wide area. The rapid reload and high-volume fire of the Katyusha allowed for saturation of target areas in minutes, a task that would take hundreds of conventional guns much longer. German artillery systems were meticulously engineered for precision and durability, which often translated into slower production rates and greater complexity in the field. The Soviet ZS, three-divisional gun, while not technologically superior on paper, was so rugged and easy to maintain that it provided a decisive advantage in reliability. This focus on functional reliability over complex, cutting-edge technology ensured that the Red Army always had the maximum number of guns operational at any given time. The Soviet practice of mounting heavy field guns, like the 152 mm howitzers, onto tank chassis to create the self-propelled artillery (SPA) units was a key innovation. These SPA units could rapidly advance with the tanks, providing immediate, heavy direct and indirect fire support, a capability the Wehrmacht often lacked. The continuous refinement of sound ranging and aerial observation techniques allowed the Soviet artillery to transition from raw mass to precision mass. By the end of the war, the combination of mass-produced conventional guns and the unique, terrifying power of the Katyusha provided a layered artillery threat. This mixed system approach was a practical demonstration of the Soviet understanding of modern combined arms warfare, centered on the god of war. The overwhelming effectiveness of Soviet artillery fundamentally reshaped military doctrine globally, particularly within the nascent NATO and Warsaw Pact alliances. Soviet military theorists, led by figures like Marshal Nikolai Voronov and Marshal Vasily Kozakov, institutionalized the lessons learned on the Eastern Front. The concept of the fire barrage and the artillery offensive became the undisputed centerpiece of all subsequent Red Army and Warsaw Pact military planning. The sheer concentration of artillery became the standard metric for measuring the combat readiness and offensive capability of a Soviet division or army. The doctrine emphasized that the battle should be won by fire before the troops even closed with the enemy, minimizing friendly casualties in the process. This legacy led to the development of massive post-war artillery forces, including some of the world's largest self-propelled guns and rocket systems. NATO armies, observing the devastating power unleashed in the late stages of the war, were forced to radically rethink their own fire support strategies. The importance of counter-battery radar, target acquisition, and hardened command and control centers became paramount in Western defense planning. The Katyusha rocket lineage continued through generations of highly capable Soviet multiple launch rocket systems, such as the BM-21 Grad. German commanders' memoirs and post-war analyses provided crucial warnings about the psychological and physical effects of mass Soviet fire, shaping Western defensive postures. The Soviet dedication to the god of war ensured that artillery would remain the dominant killer on the battlefield for decades, even in the age of precision-guided missiles. The lessons learned in the frozen mud of the Eastern Front proved that massed, coordinated firepower could still dictate the operational tempo of a modern conflict. The philosophical victory of the Soviet artillery doctrine over the Blitzkrieg model became a permanent fixture in the annals of military history. The legacy of the Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front is a stark reminder of the often brutal realities of industrial-age total war. The god of war was not a single weapon but the cumulative force of millions of shells, thousands of guns, and the dedicated industrial capacity of a nation. It was the ultimate corrective to the German hubris that believed in tactical genius over material supremacy in a prolonged, grinding conflict. The Soviet artillery force proved that an army that can deliver more shells, more often, and with greater coordination, will inevitably prevail over one that cannot. The destruction wrought upon the German armies was systemic, relentless, and decisive, shattering both their physical lines and their will to fight. The meticulous planning, mass production, and continuous doctrinal evolution of the Soviet artillery corps represent a masterful military achievement. From the improvised salvos of the early Katyushas to the final, crushing barrages of Berlin, the guns dictated the rhythm and the outcome of the war. The lessons learned by the few German commanders who survived were a grim admission that they had fundamentally misjudged their primary opponent's strength. The power of massed, indirect fire remains a fundamental pillar of modern warfare, a direct inheritance from the Soviet experience of the Great Patriotic War. The thunder of the guns on the Eastern Front stands as a permanent, deafening historical marker, reminding us of the true meaning of the God of War. The ultimate victory belonged not only to the tanks and the infantry, but to the countless, anonymous gunners who served the pieces of mass destruction. Their unwavering application of overwhelming firepower ensured that the German invasion would not only be halted, but utterly crushed. The story of the underestimation of Soviet artillery is a powerful military narrative about the collision of two doctrines, one focused on speed and one focused on sheer, devastating force. The triumph of the god of war is a testament to the fact that, in warfare, quantity and coordination can overcome sophisticated tactical advantages.